Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 223 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's episode is author and podcast host, Brian Saady. He has been on the show two previous times, episodes 133 and 207. Brian focuses a lot of his work on the drug war and what's going on in Central and South America, and that's what he's discussed on the show in the past. He's written a book series titled Rackets, on things like the drug war, prostitution, and gambling. His podcast is also called Rackets, and while it's new, it has had some great episodes so far, including a show with Rayford Davis. Brian's work has been published at sites like the 10th Amendment or the American Conservative and Mises.org. So, Brian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Well, absolutely. And I got you on to talk about why I think it's a pretty important issue today. It's certainly capturing a lot of media attention, and that is the immigrant crisis, as what's being called on the southern border, where you have people from Central America showing up at America's southern border and seeking asylum or illegally entering the country. This was, an issue that was made a huge issue. You had the migrant children crisis under Obama, then Trump's presidential campaign, his promise to build a wall. And then, of course, the left-wing reaction to that has been to call Trump and his supporters racist. And it's created a lot of tension. And rather than talking about the political issue and what to do when those people get to America, what I have Brian on to talk about today is actually what's creating the situation in countries like El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala that are leading so many people to show up at America's southern border. So I was thinking that we could start this conversation, Brian, with El Salvador. And if you want to start just by giving us a general overview and, who we need to know and what the, important dates are.
Okay. First of all, I'd probably just want to give a little perspective to the audience on the scale of the issue. Everybody's heard that quote from Trump, the famous, they're not sending their best, they're sending murderers and rapists. And he was referring to Mexico. But basically, along the border, the immigration peaked back in the year 2000. There were roughly about 1.6 million people who were apprehended at the border, and about 98% of them were Mexican nationals. But now the numbers have really changed and shifted. First of all, there's far less people crossing over into that border now. But the demographic has changed tremendously. Exactly. You mentioned El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. As of last year, there were roughly 163,000 people who came from what that area is called is the Northern Triangle of Central America. That's referring to Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, versus about 128,000 Mexicans. So, there's a lot of things to unwrap here. But yeah, well, there's also another statistic I would like to throw out there, because with this immigration issue, there are a lot of people who essentially refer to anybody who crosses that border from the Northern Triangle as a member of MS-13. That's sort of been, it's kind of a red herring with this issue. But just to kind of talk about actual numbers here, last year there were about 310,000 people who were living in the U.S. illegally who were detained. And of those people, about 0.1% of them were suspected gang members. So we're talking about roughly 300 people, not 300,000. We're talking about roughly 300 people. And I want to minimize the issue as well, because again, a lot of those suspected gang members are truly dangerous people. But again, this issue, it tends to be, there's a lot of extremism, with the politics. And again, they try to essentially label everybody who's coming from that region as a possible gang member. But why are they coming here? First of all, they're fleeing violence. If you look at El Salvador, it has the highest murder rate in the world. Honduras has the second highest murder rate. Guatemala has the ninth highest. And it's not just their region in general, Central and South America and the Caribbean. There's a lot of very similar, situations there. Roughly, 45 of the top 50 cities with the highest murder rates are in the Caribbean or Latin America. 8 out of 10 countries with the highest murder rates are in Latin America or the Caribbean. And I firmly believe that a lot of that has to do with the war on drugs. So again, a lot of these people, they're fleeing to get away from drug violence, gangs, but there are other factors that are contributing to this mass migration. I point to mainly two things: the war on drugs and the Cold War. So in my long roundabout way, you mentioned El Salvador. So again, just to give a little perspective, El Salvador had a civil war that officially started in 1980 and it ended in 1992. But before that war started, for decades, the country was run by military dictatorships. And again, that was at the height of the Cold War. And the U.S. government absolutely supported these brutal right-wing dictatorships. And then once the war started, there was even more support. We gave weapons, we gave military intelligence, we trained a lot of these soldiers. But let's also actually talk about the Civil War itself. So you had these communist guerrilla groups. And again, this was really at the peak of the Cold War. So on one side, yes, they were funded by the Soviet Union. They were trying to overthrow a government. But on the other side, we're arming this government, the El Salvador government, that was guilty of committing mass atrocities. Roughly about 70,000 people were murdered during that war. And according to government statistics, or estimates, I should say, about 85% of those murders of civilians was at the hand of the paramilitary forces or the government forces. So again, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm protective of the communist rebel groups by any means. But what we have to understand is we supported a side, and that side was guilty of mass atrocities. So what happened during that Civil War, obviously there were a lot of refugees, and roughly about 1 million of them fled the country. And then it has a lot to do with the current gang problem. When we mention MS-13, a lot of people think of it as a Salvadorian gang or a Honduran gang. And there's some truth to that, but the actual roots, that particular gang, MS-13, actually started in Los Angeles back in the 80s. One of the founders was actually a member of the Salvadorian army during the Civil War. And just to kind of give a little bit of the human side here, and again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm, how should I say this, that I'm, again, being protective of gang members. But I do think that some of it, if you think about what it was like living in El Salvador, where tens of thousands of people were being massacred by the government, that somebody who flees that area and that's basically all that they've seen in their life, it's not unfathomable that person could then go and join a gang and be part of gang culture. I think it's actually pretty darn predictable. So again, MS-13 really was a function of, it started as a result of the mass migration there in the 80s. So the Civil War ended in 92. So that's, we're creeping right into the Clinton administration. Clinton, in many ways, he wanted to be kind of a centrist. So he wanted to be tough on crime. And one of those ways was to start with mass deportation because the Civil War was over. So they really weren't considered as refugee status anymore. It was technically safe for them to be sent back. It's a complex issue. If you have legitimate suspected gang members, we don't obviously want them within our borders. But the problem is it was a counterproductive move. We deported thousands of these gang members because, again, MS-13, it started out as a Los Angeles gang, but it spread throughout the U.S. By the early 90s, once thousands of these people were deported back to El Salvador, the gang grew in prominence. It went from a national gang to an international gang. And now the majority of their members are in El Salvador. So as of now, there are roughly 200,000 people, Salvadorians, living in the United States who are probably going to lose their TPS status, temporary protected status, next year. Within El Salvador, there are roughly 70,000 what the CIA refers to as domestic refugees. Again, that's by their own numbers. So in other words, the situation is so violent and so unstable within their country. There are people who are literally refugees within their own border, and that's roughly about 70,000 people. So again, I really point to a lot of that destabilization that occurred with the Civil War that we supported. And a lot of the current problem has to do with the war on drugs. Without that prohibition, it would cut off a lot of the gang's wealth and power. They don't solely make money, from drugs. So if we ended the war, it wouldn't wipe them off the planet, but they would lose a lot of membership. They make a lot of money from extortion. But again, people who are fleeing from El Salvador, the vast majority of them are not gang members. They're trying to get away from the gangs, and those gangs, they really operate with impunity. So now there's another aspect that I do want to bring up, because we're talking about the war on drugs, is that there are a lot of disingenuous factors of the war on drugs. So when the Civil War ended, part of the agreement was we couldn't provide military aid. But in the year 2000, this was essentially the predecessor to Plan Colombia. We talked about that on the last podcast. So what we started doing was sending, quote, counter-narcotics aid to the Salvadorian government. Again, this government that's guilty of all of these different, mass human rights abuses. We get around calling it military aid by calling it counter-narcotics aid. So we're giving them and arming this very corrupt government with all this military aid, but it's supposed to be in the name of the war on drugs. But again, there's many lies and there's a lot of disingenuous aspects to the war on drugs. And really one of the things I want to point out is that one of the leaders of that civil war was a paramilitary leader. His name was Roberto de Abuzion. I think I'm pronouncing that right. He was a graduate of the School of Americas, which is basically a training ground that we've had for training these different Latin American leaders. In Latin America, it's generally referred to as the School of the Coup. Because basically any military coup that's happened in Latin America, almost time and again, it's led by a graduate of the School of the Americas. They were armed and trained on U.S. soil. He was the founder of the dominant political party that came out after the Civil War. That's called the Arena Party. It's basically the right-wing party. And you had the FMLN, which is the extreme left wing. Those are the two dominant parties that came about as a result of the Civil War. But back to Abuzion. Again, this guy, he was the paramilitary leader who was deeply connected with U.S. intelligence and U.S. government. And really one of the best indicators of this is the fact that he had his top advisor was a guy named Francisco Garolia. That's right. It was Garolia. The media at the time, I'm going back to the 1980s, labeled this guy the $6 million man. The reason why is, again, the top advisor to basically our closest ally in the war was busted at customs with $6 million in cash. His name, he was in the DEA database. All of his cohorts who were also busted were in the DEA database. But when it comes time for their trial, the prosecutors arranged a sweetheart deal. All he had to do was they slapped him with a probation fee, and even the judge in the case basically talked about this was extremely suspicious. And basically, that there are several examples like this where these major drug traffickers, where we'll look the other way as long as they are an ally in, say, the COLA or what we call our national security interests. There's just many, many examples, and that is one of them. But this guy, I mean, he was responsible for so many just awful human rights abuses. There was a very famous assassination many years ago in El Salvador. It was the Archbishop Oscar Romero. This guy was really one of the top human rights activists in the country. And again, he was murdered at the order of this same paramilitary leader who, again, was armed and trained by the U.S. government. And when I talk about all of the civilian death toll, one of the things that, I know we've got a pretty libertarian audience. So a lot, obviously economically, nobody within the Libertarian Party wants to really hear the positives or of the communist economics or socialist economics. But I'm a capitalist myself, but one thing I do want to point out is, think about it. If you lived in El Salvador, you're some peasant farmer in one of the poorest countries in the world where it's a really corrupt government run by the military. There's this basic crony capitalist system where there's really no chance for upward mobility. The rhetoric of communism and socialism, the wealth redistribution, that type of stuff really would sound fantastic to a lot of those people. But that type of political speech could really end in the death penalty. Again, the government would go through anybody who's considered a communist sympathizer. They'd kill you. They'd kill anybody in the village. And again, that kind of gives you a little indicator of just a lot of the instability that's happened in that country as a result of the Cold War. And we're essentially continuing it under the guise of the drug war. But again, we're giving all this money for military aid in the name of the drug war, but it's for this government that's entirely corrupt. The country's attorney general a couple years ago was busted for corruption in connection with drug traffickers. The ex-president fled the country for corruption charges. He's living in exile in Nicaragua. It was rumored that he actually accepted bribe money from one of the country's top drug dealers, a guy named Chepe Diablo. The vice president, there's been a lot of reports suggesting that they're actually business partners in a separate venture. So again, it's our war on drugs has caused a ton of corruption and destabilization in that country. And again, I don't want to blame it entirely on those factors, but I do think that when you think about all of those different events, you can understand why it's created an immigration crisis in that country.
Yeah, and I don't think it should be too bold of a statement, even to a libertarian audience, to say that, a right-wing, authoritarian, murderous regime who pretends to like capitalism is any better to the peasant than a socialist regime that says we're going to give you money and stuff. I mean, when you're talking about that much government anyways, it really shouldn't be all that much more preferable to have the right-wing government. But I think that's like kind of a fallacy for some libertarians anyways. The other thing I just wanted to mention is that, listeners of my show shouldn't be surprised that the United States will back drug producers just because they're, American, bad. This is a similar story to what's going on in Afghanistan. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Shouldn't come as a surprise. I did hear you mention in there that, Trump may have an opportunity, I guess, to remove, the current people living in El Salvador's temporary protection status. And I don't know, it seems kind of like what Bill Clinton did by, deporting a mass number of people from El Salvador. You ended up creating and spreading MS-13. Do you see any risk of that happening again, or would most of the people Trump be deporting would just be, kind of innocent, everyday people from El Salvador?
It's very interesting because, again, most of the people here in the U.S. Who are undocumented, the vast majority of them are not gang members. The people that they'll easily be able to round up are the people on the books showing up to legal jobs, etc. I don't foresee many of those people going forward voluntarily. Again, what they're going back to, even though it's not an official war zone, is basically a war zone. And one of the things where they get a lot of their power, again, is extortion. So they extort people back in El Salvador, but they also, the gang members here in the U.S., they also extort undocumented Salvadorian workers here in the U.S. So the more pressure that you take to remove their TPS status is actually going to give them more power. On the flip side, again, it's a very tough issue. I get it. It is called temporary protected status. They've been here for roughly 2 decades. I get it. But the main thing I just wanted to point out is that we've had a major hand in creating this crisis.
All right. Well, do you have anything else that you think we should discuss with El Salvador?
Not really. The main thing, I guess, is just pointing out that there's just tremendous violence there. And, I genuinely believe if we can end the war on drugs, that a good portion of that will go away. Because a lot of that is black market violence in order to control the flow of illegal drugs. It's a major transshipment point for cocaine. And again, these gangs, they make a lot of their money from that. Obviously, a large portion is from, typical gang crimes, robbery, extortion, all these types of things. But once you take away that consensual crime there, that will absolutely have a factor in eliminating some of that violence.
All right. Well, next, I think we can move on to Honduras. This is a country where I don't think there was a civil war at one point that the United States was involved in, but certainly starting in 2009, the United States under the Obama policy has gotten involved a lot in Honduras. So why don't you talk about that and why people from Honduras are showing up at the U.S. southern border?
Okay. Unlike El Salvador, Honduras didn't really have a civil war. It had basically a somewhat functional democracy, but that changed in 2009. The democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, he was ousted in a military coup. He was literally escorted out of the country on the private jet of one of the wealthiest men in the country. That guy's name is Miguel Facuse. He's involved in, well, he's now deceased, but he was involved in a number of different businesses. He's the definition of politically connected. His uncle was the president. But just to kind of give you a little indicator of the U.S. response, think about it. It's 2009. That's Barack Obama really at the height of his political capital. There was a lot of optimism around his time in office there. So he really had an opportunity to speak harshly and criticize a military coup. But he didn't. And in fact, really the State Department with Hillary Clinton, they really tap danced around even using the word coup, for multiple reasons. For one, if there is an actual coup, then they have to cut off foreign aid. Again, we're not talking about, rice bags for the poor. We're talking about military aid. That's the majority of the aid that we provide in this region of the world. The other factor is that the State Department was having back channel communications with really the orchestrators of the coup, in particular, Miguel Facuse. And it's disturbing on many levels. For one aspect, he's orchestrating a coup, but also the fact that the U.S. government had knowledge that there were many that this particular person had ties to drug trafficking. In particular, there's a WikiLeaks document out there that exposed that the government knew that his private jet strip was used for drug shipments. Now, they didn't actually say that he had awareness of this, but again, the U.S. government's having these back channel talks with the orchestrators of the coup. So in the interim, basically one of the leaders of this interim government was a guy named Billy Hoya. He was the leader of a deadly right-wing death squad that operated back in the 80s. They essentially executed and tortured several, political activists. Anybody was essentially considered, like a communist sympathizer. So that guy was essentially, the leader of this interim government. But again, the Obama administration, at one point they did officially call it a coup, so that meant that they had to cut off aid to the country, but that was only temporary. There was an election. I don't want to call it a sham election, but there was a lot of questionable factors there. Essentially, the military had a major presence, so there's a lot of reports of voter intimidation. But, long story short, the Honduran electorate had basically lost all faith in, elections at that point. But there's a new administration that came on board. It was Pepe Lobo, a real strong arm right-wing government, that had, a horrible human rights record. But how does the Obama administration respond to this crisis? Well, they give them more money, and it's in the form of counter-narcotics aid, which is essentially military aid, but it's supposed to be used for fighting the drug war. But the problem is this money's going to this deeply corrupt government that's really in bed with the drug traffickers. In fact, that former president, Lobo, his son is serving time in prison in the U.S. on drug trafficking charges. One of the former drug czars, he did an interview with the Miami Herald talking about how different government officials who are essentially acting as, air traffic controllers for the drug cartels. Well, guess what? He got murdered not long after that interview. And that was at the order of a major drug cartel leader. And his predecessor, the previous drug czar, had also been murdered. So just to basically sum it up, we've been supporting this really illegitimate regime there in Honduras. And really one of the biggest factors is, okay, let me back up what the precipice for the coup was. The guy, Zelaya, who was ousted in a military coup, the justification was that he was making steps towards becoming a dictator in the country. At least that was what, these coup leaders said. And what it was he wanted to put, a constitutional ballot, up for vote that would allow a second term for presidential elections. So in other words, because at that time you could only have one term, and it's definitely a touchy issue in Latin America where there have been a lot of these dictators in place. So again, that was the justification to push him out. But now that they had this right wing government in line with Pepe Lobo, the leader of the Congress and now the current president of the country, Juan Orlando Hernandez, did a lot of things in order to change that rule. He actually had Supreme Court justices removed, and they changed the Constitution to allow a second term in office. So Juan Orlando Hernandez, he won his first term in office, and he just won a second term back in 2017. And when I talked about the really questionable circumstances of an election, this one was far worse. Basically every outside independent source viewed that there was a ton of voter fraud, election fraud. That includes The Economist, all types of independent organizations. But once again, the U.S. government is essentially meddling. You can't really call it meddling. But the second, they could use that position to, call for a recount of the votes or something to really enhance the democracy in the region. But they did the opposite. They immediately, once the decision was made, or once the election results were announced, they jumped on board to congratulate this guy, Hernandez, who's had all kinds of scandals attached to him. Literally, embezzlement scandals and what's happened after that election, there was, obviously a lot of protest, and the Honduran military was used to suppress these protests. And again, this is a military that has been trained and armed by the U.S. government. They murdered several protesters. Many people were falsely imprisoned, tortured. And again, this is all at the hands of the U.S. government. So you've got that political aspect there. And again, you've got this really deeply entrenched drug corruption there, and drug violence. So we talked about MS-13. Also their rival organization, Calle Ocha, the 18th Street Gang in English, is their main rival. So that group expanded from El Salvador, and then they expanded into Honduras. So there's this massive gang population. Again, that's why it has the second highest murder rate in the world. So again, this is the main reason why so many people are fleeing this country. And that's, again, we talked about the numbers of how it started to shift from, Mexican immigrants who are leaving, mainly because of just, economic reasons. Now you've got a lot of people leaving from Central America, who are really legitimate, refugees, that they're fleeing violence and just an awful situation.
So, Honduras is probably the one country where I've read a little bit more on than the others. And most of that reporting has, I think, been done in The Intercept from what I've read in two stories. And I'm not sure if you could weigh in on any of them in more detail. And one is that I guess the Podesta group was actually hired by the Honduran elites to help, publicize in the United States, that they should, and lobby in the United States that the United States shouldn't call it a coup and should support the new government coming in. And then the other story is that I believe this is probably the military force you're talking about, and that is the Tiger Force, in Honduras that has been backed by the United States, and I believe trained by our, special forces.
Yeah, you're exactly right as far as the Tigers or Tigres, as they say. I actually was unaware of the Podesta angle. No, so that's news to me. But yeah, as you can see, there's just the coup was not orchestrated in this instance. There's been many coups in Latin America that the U.S. government has orchestrated, but in this instance, we didn't orchestrate it, but we absolutely enabled it. And the following and all of the bloodshed and just the horrible human rights record of that government, we've been funding. And in fact, we've increased the funding since that coup. And again, it's all in the name of the drug war, even though there's just all kinds of evidence. Again, I was telling you about Pepe Lobo, but also, I mean, the current president, even his own brother has been named as a person of interest in separate DEA investigations. I mean, I can go on forever about all the just different links between drug trafficking and the highest levels of the Honduran government.
All right. Well, and you did say that the president Hernandez was just reelected. Do I remember this right? That his political opponent was a reality TV star in Honduras and, was something of a reformist?
Right. I mean, he's very, very closely tied to Zelaya, the guy who was ousted. But yeah, a person with no political experience, but kind of like how we have here in the U.S., the outsider has a lot of appeal, like the situation with Donald Trump there. But, and one thing I do want to point out, his name's Nasrallah. Yeah, I'm trying to remember that. But the initial poll results, he was winning quite a bit. And what happened was they just stopped announcing the poll. They were like, say, 30% of the count in, and the government just stopped announcing it until they were like the 99% count. And guess what? The incumbent won. So there was, again, and I'm giving you a very basic version. There's a lot of evidence to show that there was just all kinds of election fraud. Voter literally buying votes, just all types of just awful stuff to suppress actual democracy in a country that just desperately needs it.
All right, I'm pretty sure I actually have a link to an article on this, so I'll throw it in the show notes page for anybody who wants to, spend the time to really get into the research there. But unless you have anything else to add on Honduras, I guess let's move on to Guatemala.
Okay. Now we're talking about coups. Well, really, one of the first CIA coups was conducted in Guatemala. They ousted a democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz. And again, this is Cold War era stuff. He was getting weapons from the Soviet Union. You can understand national security implications, but again, this was a democratically elected leader. And this was really kind of a model as far as how to conduct coups, because again, that's one of the earliest ones. It was 1953, if I'm remembering the year correctly. But basically what happened is, obviously, when you have a military coup like that, it creates a lot of instability in the country. And there was a civil war that, I guess the official numbers, it officially started in 1960 and went all the way through to 1996. And roughly about 200,000 people were killed. And again, it's kind of like El Salvador, where the vast majority of the victims were civilians. It wasn't those, rebel fighters versus government soldiers. And the thing is, many historians actually refer to this as a genocide. And the reason being because the vast majority of the victims were indigenous people, in particular Mayans. And it's a very important issue, because obviously that created a massive number of refugees who left that country. And the current state of the country is just, again, there's a lot of violence there. Gangs operate with impunity, and they're deeply connected with the government. By official estimates, there's considered to be roughly 240,000 domestic refugees living within that country because of the instability. And again, what do? We give more money in foreign aid, which is, again, military aid under the guise of the drug war, to governments that we know are deeply in bed with the drug trade. And really a perfect example, again, I like to give these WikiLeaks references, but there's a WikiLeaks document where, U.S. government sources, they were talking to one of the former presidents of the country, Otto Perez Molina, and this was at the stage where he was just a candidate. One background thing, again, he was another School of the America graduate. He's a, former, general in the country who was, linked to all kinds of war crimes. So he goes on to the presidency, but during the campaign process, he meets with different U.S. officials, and they were basically talking about how there was all kinds of reports that his campaign was openly funded by different drug cartels in the country. And I'm going to paraphrase the response. I don't remember the exact response in the document, but basically, the U.S. official said, well, there's no way to really prove that those drug links are accurate. So again, we look the other way at this corruption as long as the politics, set our, or according to what we want. But again, there's just been a long history of corruption in this country. And again, drugs are, the drug war is a major part of it. The vice president, the last vice president in the country, reports are showing that she received a $250,000 bribe from the Zetas cartel. The minister of Interior got a $1.5 million bribe from the Zetas. And even the current president of the country, there's a lot of reports suggesting that his campaign, was bankrolled by cartel money, in particular a drug lord called El Fantasma. And the current president, he has a lot of comparisons, to Donald Trump. He's another one of these guys, had no, political experience. He was a TV star and a comedian. Again, personality wise, he has a lot of comparisons, and, his administration has fallen in many ways along the lines of the Trump administration. He's immediately greeted with all kinds of different corruption scandals. Members of his family are arrested on money laundering charges. And the thing is, the corruption is so bad in this country that they actually have an outside, political body. It's from the United Nations. It's called the CICIG. So it's this independent body that's supposed to monitor for corruption. And it's been a very effective body. It's sent many people to prison. In fact, a couple more, former presidents, were sent to prison as a result of those types of investigations. So that parallel with Trump that I was referring to is he's got, Morales, that's his name, Jimmy Morales. He's facing these corruption investigations. Well, he wants to fire the special prosecutor who's leading the investigations against him. He tried to get him deported from the country. But one of the ways, and he's been very smart about this, is he has essentially befriended Donald Trump. Because again, this is a UN committee, that handles the investigation. So, for one thing, he made a very public move by moving their embassy to Jerusalem. In solidarity with Trump. So it looks like it's kind of a quid pro quo, kind of thing, or maybe it's just, a totally organic thing. But now the government of Guatemala is lobbying Donald Trump and the Trump administration to try to weaken that anti-corruption body there. But again, this is a government that's just had just deep corruption. Something like 100 members of the Congress are under investigation. So they don't really want to make, strong anti-corruption moves. But again, I like to always point out that so much of this has to do with the drug trade. Just a few months ago, one of the top generals in the country was arrested because of his links with MS-13. So again, I don't think that all of the problems and instability in this country, can be solved, but I do think that, two of the major contributing factors were the war on drugs and, the Cold War and our U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that it's hard maybe to understand how the U.S. drug war could, mess with these countries so much because it's seen as kind of a domestic policy. But I think this is a number and stat that you talked about the first time you were on my show. It's just how many billions of dollars is generated by the U.S. drug trade. Americans are rich and they have an appetite for drugs. They like to get high. And that means that I assume, I'm guessing like large portions of unbelievably big portions of these countries, actual economies are through the black market in the drug trade. And
Absolutely.
What it must mean that a good portion of your economy has to operate in the black market. That means disputes can't be solved in courts. That means when somebody steals from you, you can't call the police. That means, that you can't conduct your business in, open areas in public. This means that you have to, operate underground covertly. You have to seek revenge when somebody wrongs you. And, pretty much the only way to do it is through violence. And so the instability that has to be created from that is huge. And not to mention, you have to have an appetite for breaking the law and be, somebody who has a high enough risk tolerance to go to jail. And so I'm sure this creates a situation where there's a lot of people in these countries who get very, very rich off of the drug trade who aren't necessarily good people who look out for the best interests of others. But they're people, with super high risk tolerance and an appetite for a criminal life. So they're willing to break the bones of the guy that, steals from them or do other kinds of cruel stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And really the reason why I'm giving these examples of, say, the president or vice president of this country or whatever involved with the drug trade is because in our minds, it's so foreign to us. I mean, we're used to seeing, say, some cop or some sort of, low level official being involved with drug corruption, but it's never been quite the attorney general or the president or the vice president. So again, this stuff, it goes to the absolute highest levels and it just completely destroys the institution. And that really has, a cascading effect that just destroys so much of the structure and the culture of a country. So when you see these mass numbers of hundreds of thousands of people crossing over into the border, again, I just wanted, for the audience and for everyone, I just wanted to give some perspective on why they're doing that.
Right. And I'm sure, if you look at the United States and how much influence that the weapons makers have, and that's because, they're able to, hire lobbyists and pay congressmen and do all this other kind of stuff. I'm sure in these countries that rather than the weapons makers, it's the cartels and the gangs and the drug traffickers.
Oh, most definitely. They have a ton of influence. Like I said, when the drug czar of a country, can be murdered at the order of one of the country's most powerful drug dealers, I mean, it really just gives you an indication of just how much damage that this prohibition has done throughout the world.
And I'm sure the Cold War had huge impacts, especially when you talked about Guatemala and, hundreds of thousands, I believe, dying and being displaced in that civil war. I'm reading a book by Eric Margulies right now, War at the Top of the World, and describing post-Soviet Afghan war, how the country was fundamentally changed by that war. And when you talk about the Guatemalan civil war lasting decades and killing so many people, you have to imagine that, all the communities that were in place and everything in that, all those structures are probably gone. You've had so many people grow up orphaned or injured and have lives that they normally wouldn't have, and experiences and, increased rates of PTSD and all these other terrible things, that come along with long-term violence and conflict that I'm sure has, drastically shifted what the country was pre-war.
Absolutely. And again, I'm really trying to drive home that point that imagine if that was your life experience where all you saw were, mass atrocities and violence. So even though, yes, a civil war at some point ends, that's your whole life experience. So, moving into a life of crime, again, is a fairly predictable outcome.
Yeah, and I'm sure it must be hard to understand, especially, these long-term wars, again, Guatemala or, looking at Afghanistan, Palestine, Yemen, where, how you could understand justice. And I'm sure a life of crime is very appealing when the so-called good guys are doing terrible things to people who, are innocent as well. And so, I'm sure it's just disastrous, from a moral standpoint, physical, on an entire population.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Well, I mean, do you want, I know that, we've talked about how the immigration right now really isn't coming from Mexico, but I suppose it is still coming through Mexico. So, do you have anything to add on kind of what that journey is like for, those people from, south of the Mexican border, traveling through that country? I'm assuming that they're not planning on building a wall on Mexico's southern border.
Right. Well, the majority is coming from that northern triangle, but there still are several people leaving from Mexico because, again, we talked about in the first podcast, it's a highly unstable country in many parts of the country. There's a ton of violence that refer back to our the first podcast. I think it was 133 where we talked. But yeah, one of the things that a lot of people, you mentioned, just it's a very dangerous trip. A lot of the people die along the way. They literally have to hop on top of a train and try not to fall off. Once they make it into Mexico, a lot of times they're extorted by gangs. Again, you probably have to deal with these coyotes and organized crime figures just to get into the country. But there's been just a couple. I mean, there were several massacres that have occurred in Mexico, in relation to drug cartels. But there were a couple particular ones in a city called San Fernando, and that's a region that the Zetas has a ton of control. Something like 70 people, over 70 people were found in this mass grave. And it turned out that these were all people who were, illegal immigrants. They were trying to make their way to the U.S. But several of the men just refused to act as drug mules for the Zetas, so they just slaughtered them en masse. And there have been multiple massacres like that. But again, they're vulnerable to these gangs, and they make a ton of money off of extortion as well. And these illegal immigrants, they're also victims of that as well. So when they're coming here, they're putting their life on the line. So again, I just wanted people to at least have some perspective on this of what they've gone through to get here. And I'm not saying that maybe we should have some open borders policy. All I just wanted to do was give people some perspective on why they're coming here and what they're willing to go through and risk their life in order to get away from.
All right, Brian. I mean, thank you so much for everything that you've already had to say on the show. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything you think I didn't cover, or you have a general summary that we didn't hit?
No, I think I really hit and I would say really the two main factors, are the drug war and the Cold War. And even though the Cold War is officially over, U.S. foreign policy still essentially operates under that same guise.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and filling us in on this. I found one of the disappointing things about the coverage of the immigration crisis, I guess as they're calling it, has been a lack of, concern about why all these people are fleeing. And sometimes they'll, say they're fleeing violence, but, let's talk about the cause of the violence. And I'm sure a lot of these people would rather remain in their country. I mean, nobody wants to be chased from their home and have their lives threatened if they don't otherwise need to. And as you talk about the extremely dangerous journey that they have to make through Mexico to get to the United States is something I'm sure that, a trip that most people don't want to make. And so, rather than Donald Trump focusing on building a wall on the southern border, maybe talk about changing some of the U.S. policies here in Central America that have, led to these kind of problems. And, that at least will create less of a problem on our southern border.
Yeah, I fully agree. Let's try to address the root cause of the immigration there.
All right. Well, again, Brian, I guess you tell my audience where they could find your work, where you want to send them, all that good stuff.
Okay. You can check out my website, which is my name, Brian Saady. That's 2 A's and Saady, BRINSAADY.com. If you want to check out my podcast, it's called Rackets. Cover a lot of topics. And specifically, we talked about Latin America and the drug war. I've got a lot of information on that in my first book. It's called The Drug War, $1 Trillion Game. That's part of a 3-book series called Rackets about the legalization of drugs and gambling and the decriminalization of prostitution. If you want to, follow me on social media, you can check me out on Twitter, Facebook. It's all under my name, Brian Saady.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for coming on the show. And for those of you who want to find this show and share it, check out foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org.
Oh man, thanks so much for having me on.